Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Imagine a man packs a loaded handgun, slips 10 extra rounds of ammunition into his pocket, and crawls through a basement window to bypass the metal detectors at City Hall.
Right.
He walks directly into the mayor's office and shoots him 4 times. Then he, pauses, reloads his weapon, walks down the hall, finds another city official, and shoots him 5 times.
It is the textbook definition of premeditated murder.
Exactly. Cold-blooded murder. But what if I told you a jury looked at those exact facts and let him off with manslaughter, partly because he had been eating too many Twinkies?
I mean, it sounds completely fabricated, like an urban legend or something.
It really does.
But that is the actual legal reality of the infamous 1978 Dan White trial. It represents this moment where the justice system fundamentally broke down.
So today, for you listening, we are doing a deep dive into that exact breakdown. We're exploring the really chaotic battleground where the human mind meets the strict rules of the law.
Yeah, pulling directly from Chapter 13 of the Handbook of Forensic Psychology, 4th edition.
Right. The chapter on specific intent and diminished capacity. We're going to explore how courts actually determine if a defendant had the mental capacity to commit a crime, and well, what happens when we try to force nuanced psychological truths into these rigid legal boxes?
Because to understand how a jury could look at a double assassination and just say, manslaughter, we first have to lay down the absolute bedrock of Anglo-American criminal law.
Okay, lay on me.
So, before anyone can get a guilty verdict, the prosecution has to prove 2 distinct elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, you have the actus reus.
The actual physical act.
Exactly, the wrongful physical deed itself. And second, there's the mens rea. That is the wrongful purpose, the criminal intent driving the physical act. You absolutely need both to convict.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. If I think about this like a computer system, the actus reus is the hardware, right? It's the physical machinery executing a command.
That's a great way to put it.
And the mens rea is the software. It's the code or the intent directing the machine to cause harm. So if I have a seizure and my arm physically strikes a nurse, the hardware moved, but there was no malicious software driving it.
Right, you didn't consciously choose to perform the act.
Yeah, so there's no crime.
That analogy perfectly captures the dynamic. And, in criminal trials, people rarely argue about the hardware.
Because it's obvious.
Right, the actus reus, the fact that the gun was fired or the window is broken, is usually pretty straightforward. The real battleground is the software. It's the mens rea.
The intent.
Exactly. And when the defense attacks that mental element, we really have to make a vital distinction between global insanity and diminished capacity.
Global insanity being the absolute extreme end of the spectrum, I'm guessing.
And it is a complete defense. If you meet the criteria for legal insanity, it completely negates mens rea.
It just wipes it out.
Wipes away culpability entirely, because the law essentially says your software was so profoundly corrupted that you just aren't legally responsible for the act.
Wow. Okay, so what about diminished capacity then?
Diminished capacity is only a partial defense. It doesn't mean you're totally innocent. It basically argues that because of some mental state, maybe, short of psychosis or maybe induced by drugs or extreme distress, you couldn't form the specific intent required for the major crime you're charged with.
So it's an argument for a lesser conviction, not like an outright acquittal.
Precisely. Which means we need to understand how the law actually grades intent.
Right, because intent isn't just a yes or no thing. I know the American Law Institute, the ALI, they created a model penal code to measure this. How does that hierarchy actually work?
So the ALI model penal code grades culpability on a 4-point scale. At the very bottom, you have negligence. Above that is recklessness. Then comes knowing intent. And at the top is purposeful intent.
Okay, let's put this in the context of driving a car, just to make the mechanics totally clear for everyone. Negligence would be something like checking a text message while driving through a suburban neighborhood and accidentally hitting a parked car. You didn't mean to do it, but you should have been aware of the risk.
That is precisely the right way to look at it. To build on that, recklessness is a step up. That would be, say, driving 90 miles an hour through a school zone while kids are getting out.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You aren't actively trying to hit anyone, but you are consciously disregarding a massive, unjustifiable risk.
Right. And knowing intent is even higher. That would be like driving the getaway car in a bank robbery. You might not want anyone to get hurt, but you are practically certain your conduct is facilitating a serious crime.
Exactly. And purposeful intent is the absolute top tier.
That's me seeing my mortal enemy on the sidewalk, gripping the steering wheel, and actively aiming my car at them with the conscious object of, causing a fatal result.
Yes, that is purposeful intent. And that scale translates directly into how we define general versus specific intent in the courtroom.
How so?
Well, general intent roughly corresponds to the lower end. Breaking into a building, for example, might be a general intent crime, like trespassing. You just intended to do the physical act of entering.
But specific intent is different.
Right. Specific intent requires you to act purposefully to achieve a further result. So breaking into that building with the explicit intent to steal property inside, that elevates it to burglary, which is a specific intent crime.
Got it. And historically, first-degree murder is the ultimate specific intent crime, right? Because it requires premeditation and deliberation.
Exactly.
So if the law requires us to prove someone purposefully premeditated a crime, how did psychologists historically even measure that? I mean, how do you prove what's in someone's head?
For a very long time, they didn't. The law relied on this framework called the Omniton Rule, which was established way back in 1843 in England.
The 1840s aren't exactly known for their nuanced grasp of neuroscience.
No, they certainly were not. The Omniton standard was incredibly rigid. It essentially asked two purely cognitive questions. Did you know the nature of what you were doing? And did you know it was wrong?
That's it?
That's it. It viewed humans as purely rational actors. If you knew firing a gun would kill someone, and you knew murder was illegal, you were fully culpable.
So it completely ignored, volition or impulse control or any complex psychological drivers at all?
Completely.
I can imagine mid-20th century psychologists absolutely hating that standard. I mean, by the 1950s, you have the rise of psychoanalysis, this entire scientific field dedicated to the idea that we are driven by unconscious impulses and traumas, not just rational thought.
That tension is exactly what triggered a massive legal rebellion in California.
Really? A rebellion?
Oh, yeah. The psychological community felt the Omniton standard was barbaric because it ignored obvious, severe mental disturbances that didn't neatly erase a person's basic cognitive awareness.
Right.
So starting in the late 1950s, the California courts just decided to bypass Omniton. They started allowing psychologists to testify about a defendant's mental state during the actual guilt phase of a trial.
Using diminished capacity as a backdoor, basically, to soften the rigid rules.
Exactly.
Okay, let's trace the cause and effect of this, because the progression is staggering. It starts in 1959 with a case called People v. Gorshin, right?
Yes. Nicholas Gorshin was a longshoreman who went to work intoxicated, got into a fight with his foreman, and was sent home. He went home, got a gun, returned to the docks, and shot his foreman dead.
Which, under traditional law, he left, got a weapon, and came back. That is premeditation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But California allowed a psychiatrist to testify that Gorshin had schizophrenia. The expert argued that being sent home threatened Gorshin's fragile psychological equilibrium, compelling him to retaliate.
Wait, compelling him?
Yeah, the expert openly admitted Gorshin consciously intended to shoot the foreman, but testified he lacked free will.
Lacked free will, and the court bought that.
The California Supreme Court actually agreed. They effectively redefined legal malice to include a volitional component.
So they took a clinical explanation for why his mind was disordered and used it to legally excuse his intent.
Yeah.
That is wild. And that sets a precedent that immediately spirals out of control, right? Leading directly to the Wolf case just 5 years later.
Exactly. People v. Wolf in 1964 pushes the boundary even further. Dennis Wolf was a 15-year-old boy with schizophrenia who meticulously planned to kidnap girls for sex. Realizing his mother was an obstacle to this plan, he waited for her and beat her to death with an axe handle.
Just a horrific, undeniably planned out act. He identified an obstacle, chose a weapon, and executed the murder.
Right. And initially, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder, but the California Supreme Court stepped in and reduced the conviction to second-degree murder.
Based on what?
They looked at his obvious plotting, but ruled that because of his mental illness, he couldn't, quote, maturely and meaningfully reflect on the gravity of his act.
Wait a minute. If a kid actively plots a murder, how can a psychologist look at that sequence of events and say he didn't premeditate it just because his reflection wasn't mature? Doesn't that fundamentally destroy the whole concept of intent?
You've hit on the exact crisis this created. The court stopped asking if the defendant intended the crime and started asking why they intended it. They basically morphed diminished capacity into diminished responsibility.
Which is a huge difference.
A massive difference. And this expanding legal loophole is what made the Dan White verdict possible in 1978.
Okay, put yourself in the shoes of a juror in San Francisco during that trial. You are presented with the facts we discussed at the start. White packed extra ammo, bypassed security, killed the mayor, reloaded, and killed a supervisor.
But the defense brought out the expanded diminished capacity doctrine. They argued White was suffering from severe depression.
Right.
And an expert testified that these depressive episodes were exacerbated by his sudden binging on junk food, Twinkies, cupcakes, and Coca-Cola. The media famously dubbed it the Twinkie defense.
Which sounds so absurd, but it actually worked on the jury.
Because the experts weaponized the precedent set by Wolf. One expert literally echoed the previous court rulings on the stand, testifying that because of White's depression, he was incapable of mature and meaningful reflection.
Using the exact buzzwords.
Yep. Another said he no longer had his wits about him. The jury bought into this stretched definition of intent and convicted Dan White of mere voluntary manslaughter.
If you are listening to this and feeling a profound sense of outrage right now, you are experiencing the exact same shockwave that hit the American public in 1978. It completely shattered the public's faith in the psychiatric profession's role in the courtroom.
Oh, the fallout was immediate and massive. I mean, the verdict sparked literal riots in San Francisco. It became overwhelmingly obvious that the courts had allowed psychiatric explanations to basically erase the plain facts of intentional conduct.
Right.
And this public outrage directly caused a massive legislative backlash. In 1982, California voters passed Proposition 8, the Victims' Bill of Rights. It completely abolished the diminished capacity defense as the courts had forged it.
They basically stripped away the mature and meaningful reflection requirement and just went back to the skeletal, traditional definition of intent. Like, did you plan it? Yes or no?
Exactly. And this reckoning wasn't just isolated to California. Just a few years later, John Hinckley was acquitted by reason of insanity after attempting to assassinate President Reagan.
Oh, right.
The national fury over that verdict pushed the federal government to pass the Insanity Defense Reform Act, or IDRA, in 1984. IDRA effectively eliminated diminished capacity as an affirmative excuse in federal courts as well.
So if the court stripped away diminished capacity and essentially said, you can't use psychological trauma to excuse specific intent anymore, how does a forensic psychologist actually do their job today?
Well, they operate under really heavy restrictions now, specifically Federal Rule of Evidence 704B, which was revised right alongside IDRA. This rule strictly prohibits a mental health expert from testifying on the ultimate issue.
The ultimate issue being the final legal question, right? Like, did the defendant possess the specific intent to commit the crime?
Yes. An expert can diagnose a defendant on the stand. They can explain the mechanics of severe schizophrenia or deep depression. But they are legally banned from taking that final step and telling the jury, therefore, the defendant did not have the required mental state to commit this crime.
And there's a profound democratic philosophy behind that rule, isn't there? I mean, we don't want a medical doctor making the final moral judgment for society. The jury is the proxy for the community. The expert provides the medical data, but the community decides the ultimate moral and legal culpability.
That is the exact philosophical underpinning of Rule 704B. The ultimate conclusion is reserved for the trier of fact alone.
Let's talk mechanics, because this is where the modern forensic application gets fascinating. If an expert can't testify on the ultimate issue, how do they retrospectively evaluate a defendant's mind months after a crime occurs?
They have to use a strict mens rea approach. True diminished capacity today is incredibly rare. The forensic examiner is looking for cases where a person's cognitive state was so compromised they physically could not form the thought required for the crime.
Right.
The chapter actually provides 3 specific case studies to demonstrate how this is assessed. Let's look at case study 1, the epileptic driver.
Okay, so a man with a history of epilepsy has a seizure while driving, runs onto a sidewalk, hits pedestrians, and drives away. Fleeing the scene of an accident causing injury is a specific intent crime. You have to know you caused an accident and purposefully intend to escape liability.
Right. But how does an expert scientifically prove the man couldn't form that intent, rather than the man simply lying to avoid prison?
Yeah, you can't just ask him.
Exactly. The examiner doesn't just ask the defendant. They look at collateral data. They review medical records proving the history of epilepsy. They examine EEG results. And crucially, They analyzed witness statements from the scene.
And the witnesses in this case testified the man looked incredibly dazed and was completely unresponsive when yelled at.
Which perfectly aligns with the clinical presentation of postictal clouding.
What's that?
It's a state of profound neurological confusion that immediately follows a seizure. The expert synthesizes this data to show the jury that the man's brain was physically incapable of forming a goal-directed plan to flee. He lacked the cognitive machinery in that moment.
Though it's worth noting, he doesn't get off scot-free. He knew he had epilepsy and drove anyway. He is guilty of general intent, involuntary manslaughter, but the specific intent charge of fleeing is negated by the medical reality.
Exactly.
What about case study 2? This one explores the actuality of intent.
So this involves a rigidly obsessive man who breaks into a department store late at night. The police catch him and charge him with breaking and entering with the intent to commit larceny. That specific intent to steal is what elevates the crime.
But the man claims he was in the store's cafeteria the day before, dropped a vial of dangerous anticonvulsant medication, and became obsessively terrified a child would find it and die.
Right, so his anxiety mounts until he literally forces a door open in the middle of the night just to check the floor. And when police find him, he hasn't stolen anything.
Wow, so how do they evaluate that?
In this scenario, the forensic examiner conducts a psychological evaluation, revealing a documented history of severe hypochondria and obsessive-compulsive traits regarding children's safety.
Okay.
The expert uses this history to prove the actuality of his intent. He is absolutely guilty of the general intent crime of breaking and entering, but the psychological data proves his specific intent was not to commit larceny.
Which brings us to the most common and perhaps most difficult scenario examiners face, the invalid defense. Case study 3 features a drug addict who robs a pharmacy at gunpoint. The defense argues that because the man was going through severe withdrawal and was under extreme stress from a domestic dispute that morning, he couldn't form the specific intent for armed robbery.
This is where the forensic examiner has to draw a hard line. An expert evaluating this case must decline to offer a positive opinion on diminished capacity.
Because if we look at the hardware-software analogy again, his stress and withdrawal might explain why his software generated the command to get money, but it doesn't change the fact that the software purposefully directed him to put on a mask, hold a gun, and demand narcotics.
That's right. To build on that, the expert must recognize that the defendant was entirely capable of engaging in conscious, goal-directed behavior. He navigated to the store. He issued demands. The addiction provides the motive, but it does not negate the specific intent.
We can call this the explanation versus excuse paradigm. As a listener, if you take nothing else away from this deep dive, remember this paradigm. A psychological evaluation can perfectly explain why a tragedy occurred, but a clinical explanation does not equal a legal excuse.
That is the core lesson of Chapter 13. The law is a pragmatic, skeletal framework designed to keep society functioning. It operates on practical realities. Mental health professionals possess profound tools for explaining human behavior, but they cannot use those tools to unilaterally redefine what the law considers requisite criminal intent.
It is a delicate, often frustrating balance, and it leaves you with the final thought to mull over as you go about your day. As neuroscience continues to advance at light speed, as we learn exactly how trauma, biology, and environment physically map our brain's impulses down to the individual neuron, will our legal system ever truly be able to accommodate the complex biological realities of how human intent is actually formed? Or will the courts always have to rely on these rigid legal fictions simply because the chaotic truth of the human mind is too messy for a courtroom to handle?
It is a fundamental tension between science and justice, and honestly, it is not going away anytime soon.
From the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for joining us as we explored the fascinating intersection of psychology and the law. Keep questioning the framework. We'll see you next time.